Part 1. The Lady Killer. Chapter 1. In these dungeons, the darkness was complete. But Katza had a map in her mind. One that had so far proven correct, as Old's maps tended to do. Katza ran her hand along the cold walls and counted doors and passageways as she went, turning when it was time to turn, stopping finally before an opening that should contain a stairway leading down. She crouched and felt forward with her hands. There was a stone step, damp and slippery with moss, and another one below it. This was Ool's staircase then. She only hoped that when he and Kitten followed her with their torches, they would see the moss line, tread carefully, and not waken the dead by clattering headlong down the steps. Katza slunk down the stairway, one left turn and two right turns. She began to hear voices as she entered a corridor where the darkness flickered orange with the light of a torch set in the wall. Across from the torch was another corridor where, according to all, anywhere from 2 to 10 guards should be standing watch before a certain cell at the passageway's end. These guards were Katza's mission. It was for them that she had been sent first. Katza crept toward the light and the sound of laughter. She could stop and listen to get a better sense of how many she would face. But there was no time. She pulled her hood down low and swung around the corner. She almost tripped over her first 4 victims, who were sitting on the wall across from each other, their backs against the wall, legs splayed, the air stinking with whatever strong drink they'd brought down here to pass the time of their watch. Katza kicked and struck at temples and necks. The 4 men lay slumped together on the floor before amazement had even registered in their eyes. There was only one more guard, sitting before the cell bars at the end of the corridor. He scrambled to his feet and slid his sword from its sheath. Katza walked toward him, certain that the torch at her back hid her face, and particularly her eyes, from this sight. She measured his size, the way he moved, the steadiness of the arm that held the sword toward him. Stop there. It's clear enough what you are. His voice was even. He was brave, this one. He cut the air with his sword, in warning. You don't frighten me. He lunged toward her. She ducked under his blade and whirled her foot out. Clipping his temple, he dropped to the ground. She stepped over him and ran to the bars, squinting into the darkness of the cell. A shape huddled against the back wall. A person, too tired or too cool to care about the fighting going on. Arms wrapped around legs, and head tucked between knees. He was shivering. She could hear his breath. She shifted, and the light She saw the glimmer of the gold in his ear. All's maps had served them well, for this man was a lion in it. He was the one they were looking for. She pulled on the door latch. Locked. Well, that was no surprise, and it wasn't her problem. She whistled once. Low like an owl, she stretched in brave guard, flat on his back, and dropped one of her pills into his mouth. She ran up the corridor, turned unfortunates on their back beside each other, and dropped a pill into each of their mouths, just as she was beginning to wonder if all and Gideon had lost themselves in the dungeons. They appeared around the corner and slipped past her. A quarter hour, no more. A quarter hour, my lady. All's voice was a rumble. Go safely. Their torchlight splashed the walls as they approached the cell. The lioned man moaned and drew his arms in closer. Katza caught a glimpse of his torn-stained clothing. She heard Gideon's ring of long picks clink against itself. She would have liked to have waited to see that they opened the door, but she was needed elsewhere. She tucked her packet of pills into her sleeve and ran. The cell guards reported to the dungeon guard, and the dungeon guard reported to the underguard. The underguard reported to the castle guard, the night guard, the king's guard, the wall guard, and the garden guard also reported to the castle guard. As soon as one guard noticed another's absence, the alarm would be raised, and if Katza and her men weren't far enough away, all would be lost. They would be pursued. It would come to bloodshed. They would see her eyes, and she would be recognized. So she had to get them all. Every guard. All had guessed there would be 20. Prince Raffin had made her 30 pills just in case. Most of the guards give her no trouble. If she could sneak up on them, or if they were crowded in small groups, they never knew what hit them. The castle guard was a bit more complicated, because 5 guards defended his office. She swirled through the lot of them, kicking and kneeing and hitting, and the castle guard jumped up from his guardhouse desk, burst through the door, and ran into the fray. I know a Graceling when I see one. He jabbed with his sword, and she rolled out of the way. Let me see the color of your eyes, boy. I'll cut them out. Don't think I won't. It gave her some pleasure to knock him on the head with the hilt of her knife. She grabbed his hair, dragged him on his back, and dropped a pill onto his tongue. They would say when they woke to their headaches and their shame that the culprit had been a Graceling boy, graced with fighting, acting alone. They would assume she was a boy, because in her plain trousers and hood, she looked like one. And because when people were attacked, it never occurred to anyone that it might have been a girl, and none of them had caught a glimpse of Ol or Gideon. She had seen to that. No one would think of her. Whatever the Graceling lady was, or might be, she was not a criminal who her off just that morning. The whole city watching, with Captain Ole and Gideon, Rhonda's underlord, escorting her. Only a day of very hard riding in the wrong direction could have brought her south to King Murgon's court. Katza ran through the courtyard, past flower beds, fountains, and marble statues of Murgon. It was quite a pleasant courtyard, really, for such an unpleasant king. It smelled of grass and rich soil, and the sweetness of dew-dropped flowers. She raced through Murgon's courtyard, a trail of drug guards stretching out behind her. Drugged, not dead. An important distinction. Ole and Gideon, and most of the rest of the secret council, had wanted her to kill them. But at the meeting to plan this mission, she'd argued that killing them would gain no time. What if they wake? Gideon had said. Prince Raven had been offended. You doubt my medicine. They won't wake. It would be faster to kill them, Gideon had said. His brown eyes insistent. Head in the dark room nodded. I can do it in the time allotted, Katza had said. And when Gideon had started to protest, she'd held up her hand. Enough. I won't kill them. If you want them killed, you can send someone else. Oh had smiled and clapped the young lord on the back. Just think, Lord Gideon, it'll make it more fun for us. The perfect robbery, past all of Murgon's guards, and nobody hurt. It's a good game. The room had erupted with laughter, but Katza hadn't even cracked a smile. She wouldn't kill, not if she didn't have to. A killing couldn't be undone, and she'd killed enough, mostly for her uncle, King Ronda, thought her useful. When border ruffians were stirring up trouble, why send an army if you could send a single representative? It was much more economical. But she killed for the council too, when it couldn't be avoided. This time, it could be avoided. At the far end of the orchard, she came upon a guard who was old, as old perhaps as the lionhead. He stood in a grove of yearling trees, leaning on his sword, his back round and bent. She snuck up behind him and paused. A tremor shook the hands that rested on the hilt of his blade. She didn't think much of a king who didn't retire his guards in comfort when they'd gotten too old to hold a sword steady. But if she left him alone, he would find the others she'd felled and raise the alarm. She struck him once, hard, on the back of the head, and he slumped and let out a puff of air. She caught him and lowered him to the ground as gently as she could, and then dropped the pill into his mouth. She took a moment to run her fingers along the lump forming on his skull. She hoped his head was strong. She had killed once by accident. A memory she held close to her consciousness. It was how her grace had announced its nature a decade ago. She'd been a child, barely 8 years old. A man, who was some sort of distant cousin, had visited the court. She hadn't liked him. His heavy perfume, the way he leered my sweetness, storytelling, mind reading. I know you're a dancer. Katza hadn't known what her grace was. Some graces took longer than others to surface, but even if she had known, she wouldn't have cared to discuss it with his cousin. She'd scowled at the man and turned away, but then his hand had slid toward her leg, and her hand had flown out and smashed him in the face. So hard and so fast that she pushed the bones of his nose into his brain. Ladies in the court had screamed. One had fainted. When they lifted him from the pool of blood on the floor, and he turned out to be dead, the court had grown silent, backed away. Frightened eyes, not just those of the ladies now, but those of the soldiers, the sordid underlords, all directed at her. It was fine to eat at the meals of the king's chef, who was graced with cooking, or send them their horses to the king's graced horse doctor. But a girl graced with killing, this one was not safe. Another king would have banished her, or killed her, even if she was his sister's child. But Rhonda was clever. He could see that in time, his niece might serve a practical purpose. He sent her to her chambers and kept her there for weeks as punishment, but that was all. When she emerged, they all ran to get out of her path. They'd never liked her before, for no one liked the graced, but at least they tolerated her presence. Now there was no pretense of friendliness. Watch for the girl with the blue-eyed, green-eyed one. They would whisper to guests. She killed her cousin with one strike because he complimented her eyes. Even Rhonda kept out of her way. A murderous dog might be useful to a king, but he didn't want it sleeping at his feet. Prince Raffin was the only one who sought her company. You won't do it again, will you? I don't think my father will let you kill anyone you want. I never meant to kill him, she said. What happened? Kansa sent her mind back. I felt like I was in danger, so I hit him. Prince Raffin shook his head. You need to control a grace, he said, especially a killing grace. You must, or my father will stop us from seeing each other. This was a frightening notion. I don't know how to control it. Raffin considered this. You could ask all. The king's spies know how to hurt without killing. It's how they get information. Raffin was 11, 3 years Katza senior, and by our young standards, very wise. She took his advice and went to Ol, King Roundus Graying Captain, and his spy master. Ol wasn't foolish. He knew to fear the quiet girl with the one eye blue and one eye green. But he also had some imagination. He wondered, as it had occurred to him, no one else to wonder whether Katza hadn't been just as shocked by her cousin's death as everyone else. And the more he thought about it, the more curious he became about her potential. precision and intensity of a killing blow versus a maiming blow. She learned how to disarm a man, and how to break his leg, and how to twist his arm so severely that he would stop struggling and beg for release. She learned to fight with a sword, and with knives and daggers. She was so fast and focused, so creative. She could find a way to beat a man senseless, with both arms tied to her sides. Such was her grace. In time, her control improved, and she began to practice with Rwanda's soldiers, 8 or 10 at a time, and in full suits of armor. Her practices were a spectacle, grown men grunting and clattering around clumsily, an unarmed child whirling and diving among them, knocking them down with a knee or a hand that they didn't see coming until they were already on the floor. Sometimes members of the court would come by to watch her practices. But if she caught their gaze, their eyes would drop, and they would hurry on. King Rhonda had not minded the sacrifice of all his time. He thought it necessary. Katza wouldn't be useful if she remained uncontrolled. And now, in King Mergon's courtyard, no one could criticize her control. She moved across the grass, beside the gravel paths, swiftly, soundlessly. By now, all and Gideon had almost reached the garden wall, where 2 of Mergon's servants, friends of the council, guarded their horses. She was nearly there herself. She saw the dark line ahead, black against a black sky. Her thoughts rambled, but she wasn't daydreaming. Her senses were sharp. She caught the fall of every leaf in the garden, the rustle of every branch, and so she was astonished when a man stepped out of the darkness and grabbed her from behind. He wrapped his arm around her chest and held a knife to her throat. He started to speak, but in an instant she had dead-ended his arm, wrenched the knife from his hand, and thrown the blade to the ground. She flung him forward over her shoulders. He landed on his feet. Her mind raced. He was graced. A fighter. That much was clear. And unless he had no feeling in the hand that had raked her chest, he knew she was a woman. He turned back to her. He turned back to face her. They eyed each other, warily, each no more than a shadow to the other. He spoke. I've heard of a lady with a particular grace. His voice was so gravelly and deep. There was a lilt to his words. It was not an accent, he knew. She must learn who he was, so that she could know what to do with him. I can't think what that lady would be doing so far from home, running through the courtyard of King Mergon at midnight, he said. He shifted slightly, placed himself between her and the wall. He was taller, his movements, like a cat, deceptively calm, ready to spring. A torch on the path nearby caught the glimmer of a small gold hoops in his ears, and his face was unbearded, like a lioness. She shifted and swayed her body ready like this. She didn't have much time to decide. He knew who she was, but if he was a lioness, she didn't want to kill him. Don't you have anything to say, lady? Surely, you don't think I'll let you pass without an explanation. There was something playful in his voice. She watched him quietly. He stretched his arms in one fluid motion, and her eyes unraveled the bands of gold that gleamed on his fingers. It was enough. The hoops in his ears, the rings, the lilt in his words. It was enough. You're a lioness, she said. You have good eyesight, he said. Not good enough to see the color of your eyes. He laughed. I think I know the color of yours. Common sense told her to kill him. You're one to speak of being far from home, she said. What's a lion doing in the court of King Margot? I'll tell you my reasons if you tell me yours. I'll tell you nothing, and you must let me pass. Must I? If you don't, I'll have to force you. Do you think you can? She faked to her right, and he swung away easily. She did it again. Faster. Again. He escaped her easily. He was very good. But she was Katsa. I know I can, she said. Ah, his voice amused. But it might take you hours. Why was he playing with her? Why wasn't he raising the alarm? Perhaps he was a criminal himself. A Graceling criminal. And if so, did that make him an ally or an enemy? Would the lioness approve of her rescue of the lioness prisoner? Yes, unless he was a traitor. Or unless this lioness didn't even know the contents of Murgon's dungeons. Murgon had kept the secret well. The council wouldn't tell her to kill him. The council would tell her she put the men at risk if she left the men alive when he knew her identity. But he was unlike any thug she'd ever encountered. He didn't feel brutish, or stupid, or threatening. She couldn't kill one lioness while rescuing another. She was a fool, and she would probably regret it. But she wouldn't do it. I trust you, he said. Suddenly, he stepped out of her path and waved her forward. She thought him very strange and impulsive, but she saw he'd relaxed his guard, and she wasn't one to waste an opportunity. In an instant, he was too weak to hold himself up. They stopped only once to wrap him in more blankets. Katza was impatient to keep moving. Doesn't he know it's midsummer? He's frozen, my lady, all said. He's shivering. He's ill. It's no use if our rescue kills him. They talked about stopping, building a fire, but there was no time. They had to reach Ronda City before daybreak, or they would be discovered. Perhaps I should have killed him, she thought as they thundered through dark forests. Perhaps I should have killed him. He knew who I was, but he hadn't seemed threatening or suspicious.